Good evening. This is the second try I'm making at this, so I hope I'll make it work. I'm trying a short introductory video to introduce the ideas of fantasy, horror, and science fiction for weeks 10 and 11. I don't have much expertise in this, so I did a lot of research over the past few days to try to find out more. And so what you're going to get is a summary of kind of what I've learned, so I hope you'll find it helpful. Um, let's make some quick distinctions here. Fantasy is the kind of fiction that tends to look backwards at some particular point in the past. Different time, different place, but it's always something that's relatively historically accurate as a rule, but it's something that happened long ago and far away, to use the language that George Lucas uses in Star Trek, Star Wars. Science fiction is the opposite in the sense that it looks forward. It tends to look at places and times and settings that don't yet exist or exist far away, the things that we can't see. They also, science fiction relies very heavily on technology that may not exist or that could exist. Both of them, however, fantasy and science fiction, have an internal kind of logic that becomes clear once you enter into the world of the story. You just surrender your disbelief like we always do with fiction. But once you accept, well, we're on Mars or we're in 17th century France, that's where we stay as a rule. You don't see people coming in and out of it very much. Horror, the third thing I want to mention here, is the kind of fiction that's designed to frighten us. It's designed to take images and ideas from our subconscious or our unconscious and bring those up and let us confront them. And for many people, that can be very helpful in the sense that it could be very purgative. You can release fears that you've had because you're suddenly confronted with, well, like, whatever scares you to death, whatever that could be, darkness, horrible monsters, whatever, ghosts. And you're able to confront it in a fictional way and then figure out how you would deal with it. It's a way of rationalizing our responses to these kinds of things. This is a notion that I borrow from Aristotle's notion of tragedy, 4th century BC. They didn't really have horror fiction. It was like non-existent. Horror fiction is pretty much of an 18th century and afterwards kind of creation in Western culture. But Aristotle said that we went to tragedy because we were looking for this purgative kind of experience, to seeing something terrible happen in front of us and say, oh, well, thank goodness that's not me, or figure out that there's more going on the stage that might be applicable to our own lives. It's one of the many purposes that fiction has. As St. Augustine says, fiction should do two things. It should teach and it should delight. And horror fits in that category in the sense that it teaches us, it shows us that maybe our fears are not as horrible, as terrifying as they might otherwise be. We've got 4 stories we're dealing with this week. The first one is The Lottery. You have a normal seeming village. It's set in a contemporary time and place, what a New England village would have looked like in 1948 when the story was written. If you go to Blackboard, you'll see an article about the village, Bennington, Vermont, that it was actually set in, where Shirley Jackson lived. But this normal seeming village has a dark secret at it, and that's that once a year they get together and they pick one person in the town to stone to death. And everybody in the town is eligible, whether they're a 2-year-old, whether they're a brand new baby, whether they're 80 years old, everybody takes the same chance. Very scary stuff for me. Those Who Walk Away from Omelas is more of a fantasy. It's set in some previous time, previous place. We don't know where it is. We know that people ride horses, they have trains, but they don't have helicopters, they don't have policemen. There's a lot of stuff that they don't have. So we know that it's specifically a fantasy. But it's a fantasy that really rests on the torturous treatment of a 6-year-old child, that without that torturing going on, the rest of the happy society couldn't exist. So I think it's more fantasy than it is horror, but as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's a lot of overlap between these categories. The next 2 stories for week 11, The Metamorphosis, is Franz Kafka's famous story about a man, Gregor Samsa, who wakes up and finds himself turned into a big bug. You can see a reference to that up here in the right-hand corner, where you see this reference to Charlie Brown and Linus and stuff, the day that Charlie Brown found himself turned into a big bug, for those of you who are Peanut fans. Old Man with Enormous Wings is somewhere between fantasy and science fiction and horror. It's what's called magic realism. That is, it's a real place and a real time with real people, but odd things happen. A man washes up on the shore with wings. And he's not understood, and so we're not sure if we're reading The Metamorphosis or if we're reading Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor. It's a story about Jesus coming back to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition, and a judge saying, we in the church have gone past you. We don't need you anymore, Jesus, which is a scary thought. So those are our 4 stories. 2 issues that pop up with this. One is power, the other is religion. Fantasy, some people argue, is about disrupting existing power structures. What would power structures look like, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? And do those power structures have any applicability to the world that we live in now? And it lets us see different possibilities. Science fiction, many people argue, is a safe space for people to experiment with things that would not be possible in mainstream fiction. The most famous example of this, probably way before most of your time, I think, is the famous interracial kiss on television from Star Trek in 1967 or 68 when Captain Kirk kissed Lieutenant Uhura, an African woman, literally an African woman in the story. And it's the first time a black person and a white person kissed each other on the screen. And so it was this idea of exploring racial relationships in a science fiction world gave them a certain amount of freedom. They didn't have to follow the normal rules. People looked at it and said, well, that's just what happens in the 25th century. It's not what's happening now. But it did cause people to question some of the values and beliefs that they brought to bear in their own lives as well as in their television watching in that period. Horror, as I've mentioned before, is another sort of power issue in the sense that by bringing up our fears into the open, by looking at the horrible, nasty things that might scare us to death when we're just thinking about it, and suddenly when we're confronted with it in some kind of realistic way, we begin to be able to assert control over it. It loses some of its power to horrify. It loses some of its power to control us. Religion is kind of another issue. As I mentioned, in The Old Man with Enormous Wings, there's explicit references to Christianity. Some people in the village, when he washes up, says he must be an angel. And other guys say, no, he doesn't speak Latin. So, angels speak Latin. And it is meant to borrow from the Dostoevsky story. Christ appears, as I said, during the Spanish Inquisition, and the people who were running that, who were persecuting Jews and persecuting heretics of all kinds, say, Jesus, we don't need you anymore. In the other stories, it's kind of implicit. When we look at the lottery, this is New England Village. If you're in a New England village, the most prominent building is almost always a white clapboard Congregational church. In this village, there's no church, there's no clergyman. And that tells you something. It also suggests that there's some issues in there with power because there's no policeman, there's no sheriff, there's no mayor, there's no judge. The only government official in the town is a postmaster. Everybody else is just a citizen. So it's kind of scary in that story in terms of power. But the religious piece is interesting because there's no moral center to that story that questions this practice of the lottery. In Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, we're told that there is religion but no clergy, so there aren't any religious figures in that story. In the Metamorphosis, there's no religious figures. So this might be interesting in terms of its absence. If you don't see something there, maybe it's significant. Okay. But there is religion in a sense that Those Who Walk Away from Omelas and the lottery both explicitly rely on the idea of a scapegoat. And this comes from Old Testament, from Leviticus chapter 16, verse 10, the idea of sending an animal out into the desert to die with all the sins of the tribe carried